The first bullet cracked past Elena Vasquez's ear at 0347 hours, close enough that she could smell the copper tang of its wake. She pressed her back against the crumbling concrete wall of what had once been a school in the mountains of Afghanistan, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the broken window above her head, muzzle flashes lit up the pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireflies, and the distinctive pop-pop-op of AK-47s echoed off the valley walls. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Medic. The voice belonged to Sergeant Marcus Tank Thompson, the team's heavy weapons specialist, and it carried a note of panic that Elena had never heard from him before. Tank was the kind of man who could carry a 240 Bravo machine gun like it was a toy, who'd earned his nickname by walking through enemy fire with the casual indifference of someone checking his mail. If Tank was scared, things were worse than bad. Elena clutched her medical bag tighter, the familiar weight of it both a comfort and a burden. The bag contained everything she needed to keep her team alive: morphine, tourniquets, chest seals, hemostatic gauze, and a dozen other tools that could mean the difference between a soldier going home to his family or going home in a box. But right now, with bullets whining overhead and the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar beginning to fill the air, the bag felt heavier than ever. She'd been with Bravo Team for 8 months now, ever since the brass had decided that Special Forces units needed embedded medics for their deep reconnaissance missions. 8 months of being called Doc with barely concealed resentment. 8 months of hearing whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. 8 months of proving herself over and over again, only to wake up the next morning and start all over. The worst part wasn't the weight of expectation. Elena had carried that her entire life, from the barrios of East Los Angeles where she'd grown up, through 4 years of pre-med at UCLA, through the grueling months of Army combat medic training. The worst part was the weight of their doubt, the constant undercurrent of skepticism that followed her like a shadow. They called her Burden when they thought she couldn't hear, a cruel twist on her call sign, Bird, that cut deeper than any physical wound. But Elena Vasquez hadn't made it this far by backing down from a fight. She'd learned to fight early, in the cramped apartment she'd shared with her grandmother, her mother, and 2 younger brothers. Abuela Rosa had taught her that strength wasn't about size or volume, it was about endurance, about outlasting whatever tried to break you. Mia, she'd whispered during those long nights when the sirens wailed outside their window, the oak tree bends in the storm, but it doesn't break. Be the oak tree. Now, crouched in the ruins of a school halfway around the world, Elena could almost smell her grandmother's cooking, could almost hear the distant sound of mariachi music drifting from the neighbor's radio. But the memory lasted only a second before another burst of gunfire brought her crashing back to the present. Bird, where the hell are you? The voice belonged to Captain Jake Morrison, Bravo Team's commanding officer. Morrison was a West Point graduate with 15 years of Special Forces experience, a man who could read a battlefield like a chess master reading a board. He was also the one person on the team who'd never once called her Burden, who'd fought the brass tooth and nail to keep her assigned to his unit, despite the complaints from some of his men. Elena took a deep breath, tasting dust and cordite on her tongue. Through the broken doorway to her left, she could see the rest of Bravo Team spread out across the compound's courtyard, pinned down by withering fire from at least 3 directions. Tank was behind an overturned metal desk, his massive frame somehow compressed into impossible compactness as bullets sparked off the steel surface above his head. Staff Sergeant Luis Razor Martinez, the team's explosives expert, had taken cover behind a pile of concrete rubble, his usually immaculate uniform now gray with dust and torn at the shoulder where shrapnel had found its mark. And there, 20 meters away behind what remained of a stone planter, Captain Morrison was dragging someone into cover. Even in the dim light, Elena could see the dark stain spreading across the wounded man's chest, could see Morrison's lips moving in what she knew were words of reassurance that might or might not be lies. The wounded soldier was Corporal Danny Ghost Williams, the team's youngest member at just 22. Ghost had earned his call sign for his ability to move through enemy territory without making a sound. But he'd earned Elena's respect 3 months ago during a raid in Helmand Province, while the rest of the team had been focused on their primary objective. Ghost had noticed Elena struggling with a piece of equipment that had been damaged during insertion. Without a word, without asking for credit or recognition, he'd fixed the problem and moved on. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time anyone on the team had helped her without being ordered to do so. Now, Ghost was bleeding out in a courtyard in the Hindu Kush, and Elena was the only thing standing between him and a death that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. She checked her watch. 0349 hours. They'd been in contact with the enemy for 2 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. According to the intel briefing, this compound was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance target, an abandoned school that Taliban fighters were using as a supply cache. Get in, assess the threat level, call in an airstrike if necessary, get out. A milk run, Morrison had called it. The kind of mission they could execute in their sleep. Nobody had mentioned the 30 Taliban fighters who'd been waiting for them. Nobody had mentioned the heavy machine guns positioned in the hills around the compound. Nobody had mentioned that this was a trap. The engagement had started the moment they'd breached the outer wall. The Taliban fighters had waited until Bravo team was fully committed to the courtyard before opening fire. A classic O-shaped ambush that had caught them in a killing field with no easy escape routes. Elena had been bringing up the rear with the team's radio operator, Specialist Tommy Wire Jackson, when the first shots were fired. Wire had immediately dropped to one knee and started calling for backup, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos erupting around them. Palhorse 6, this is Bravo 7, we are in contact. Heavy contact at grid, November Delta 478291. Multiple enemy combatants. Crew-served weapons, danger close mortar. Request immediate air support, over. The response had crackled back through the radio with maddening clarity. Bravo 7, Palhorse 6. Closest air assets are 45 minutes out. Hold what you've got. 45 minutes. Elena's medical training told her that the human body could bleed out in less than 5 minutes with the right kind of wound. Ghost didn't have 45 minutes. None of them did. Another mortar round whistled overhead, this one close enough that Elena could feel the displacement of air against her face. The explosion, when it came, shook dust from the ceiling above her and set a shower of concrete fragments raining down into the courtyard. Through the smoke and debris, she could see Morrison waving frantically in her direction, his face a mask of desperate urgency. Elena closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about the photograph in her cargo pocket, a picture of her family taken last Christmas, the last time they'd all been together. Her mother, still beautiful at 52, wearing the nurse's uniform that had put Elena through medical school. Her brothers, both in college now thanks to Elena's army benefits. And Abuela Rosa, 93 years old, and still fierce as a mountain cat, her gnarled hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes holding all the wisdom of a life lived without compromise. Be the oak tree, Elena whispered to herself, and then she was moving. The first 20 meters were the worst. Elena had to cross an open section of courtyard with no cover except speed, and the hope that the Taliban fighters were too busy with the rest of Bravo team to notice one small figure darting through the shadows. She ran low and fast, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with every step, her boots finding purchase on loose gravel and broken stone. Behind her, she could hear Wire shouting coordinates into his radio, his voice growing more strained with each transmission. A burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground to her left, sparking off stones and sending chips of rock spinning through the air. Elena didn't slow down. She'd learned a long time ago that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when lives depended on her skills, her training, her willingness to run toward danger instead of away from it. She reached Morrison's position just as another mortar round exploded somewhere behind them, the concussion wave strong enough to rattle her teeth. Morrison looked up as she slid into cover beside him, his face streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes holding the kind of desperate hope that officers tried never to show their troops. "Ghost took one in the chest," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled panic. "It's bad, Bird, real bad." Elena was already moving, her hands automatically reaching for her medical supplies as her eyes assessed the damage. Ghost was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. The entry wound was just below his left collarbone, and the exit wound, Elena's heart sank when she saw it, was the size of a silver dollar. Right where his shoulder blade should have been. The bullet had been tumbling when it hit him, probably after ricocheting off something hard. Instead of punching a clean hole through his body, it had torn a ragged channel through muscle and tissue, nicking his subclavian artery and causing massive internal bleeding. Without immediate surgery, Ghost would be dead within minutes, but Elena Vasquez hadn't become the youngest combat medic ever accepted into Special Forces selection by accepting that some wounds were fatal. She'd made it this far by refusing to let death have the final word. "Ghost," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos around them. "I need you to stay with me, okay? You're going to be fine. But I need you to keep your eyes open. And keep talking to me." Ghost's eyes focused on her face with obvious effort. "Doc," he whispered, and there was something in his voice, surprise, maybe, or relief that she'd never heard before. "I knew you'd come." As Elena worked to stabilize Ghost's wounds, using every technique she'd learned in her combat medic training, she found herself wondering how they'd ended up here. The intelligence had seen solid satellite photos showing minimal activity, signal intercepts indicating that the compound was used only for supply storage. Even the mission timing had been carefully chosen to avoid civilian casualties and maximize their tactical advantage. But intelligence, Elena had learned, was often just another word for educated guessing. And sometimes the guess was wrong. Taliban fighters who had ambushed them weren't the usual collection of farmers and fanatics that Bravo team had been encountering in this region. These were experienced fighters, possibly foreign fighters, who had set up their ambush with military precision. The placement of their machine gun nests, the timing of their mortar fire, the discipline they'd shown in waiting for the optimal moment to spring their trap, all of it spoke to a level of training, an experience that made Elena's blood run cold. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting against professionals who had every advantage except one: Bravo team's refusal to quit. As she worked on Ghost's wounds, Elena became aware of voices around her, fragments of conversation that penetrated the fog of her medical focus. Morrison was coordinating with the rest of the team, his voice cutting through the gunfire with practiced authority. "Razor, I need you to get eyes on that machine gun position at 2 o'clock. Tank, keep suppressing the guys in the building. To our north, Wire, where the hell is that air support?" Wire's response was barely audible over the sound of incoming fire. "Still 28 minutes out, sir. I've got artillery standing by, but they won't shoot danger close without positive identification of our position." 28 minutes. Elena finished applying a pressure bandage to Ghost's chest wound and reached for her morphine. Even with the drugs, Ghost would be in agony, but pain was better than death. At least for now. She was drawing up the morphine when she heard something that made her freeze, the distinctive whine of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. The sound was different from mortar, higher pitched, more urgent, and it was getting closer. RPG. Morrison shouted, and everyone in the courtyard tried to make themselves smaller. The explosion came a heartbeat later, close enough that Elena felt the heat wash over her face like opening an oven door. Shrapnel zinged overhead, and somewhere, In the compound, she could hear someone screaming. Not the angry shouts of combat, but the high, thin wail of someone who'd been badly hurt. Elena finished injecting the morphine and looked up to see Morrison staring at her with something she'd never seen in his eyes before, complete trust. "Can you move him?" he asked. Elena checked Ghost's pulse and breathing. The morphine was taking effect, and the pressure bandages were holding for now. Moving him would be risky, but staying here while the Taliban fighters adjusted their mortar fire would be suicide. "Give me 2 minutes to stabilize his spine," she said. "Then we move." As Elena worked to prepare Ghost for transport, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Morrison 3 days ago, just before this mission began. They'd been sitting in the team's temporary command post, a converted shipping container that smelled like diesel fuel and instant coffee, reviewing the intelligence reports one final time. "You know," Morrison had said, looking up from a satellite photo, "some of the guys think you shouldn't be here." Elena had looked up from her medical supplies, meeting his eyes without flinching. "And what do you think, sir?" Morrison had been quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "I think," he'd said finally, "that those guys have never had to carry a wounded teammate off a battlefield. They've never had to look into someone's eyes and promise them they're going to make it home, knowing that promise might be a lie." He'd paused, setting down the photograph and leaning forward in his chair. "You know what I see when I look at you, Bird. I see someone who understands that every life on this team matters. I see someone who'll run toward danger instead of away from it, someone who won't quit even when quitting would be easier." Morrison had stood up then, preparing to leave, but he'd stopped at the door and looked back at her one more time. "The guys who call you burden? They're scared. Not of the enemy, we're all scared of that. They're scared of caring too much, of getting attached to someone who might not make it home. It's easier to keep you at arm's length than to admit that they need you." Now, as Elena finished securing Ghost for transport, she wondered if Morrison had somehow known that this mission would test every word he'd spoken. The universe had a way of forcing people to confront their deepest beliefs, and tonight it seemed determined to find out whether Elena Vasquez really was the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. The evacuation from the school compound had been a nightmare choreographed in blood and adrenaline. Elena had worked with Tank and Razor to carry Ghost through a gauntlet of enemy fire, using smoke grenades and covering fire to mask their movement. By the time they'd reached the extraction point, a cluster of boulders 300 meters from the compound, Ghost's condition had stabilized enough that Elena dared to hope he might survive. But survival and recovery were two very different things. And as Elena sat in the medical tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman 12 hours later, she found herself staring at the after-action report with a mixture of exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to despair. The official summary was clinical in its brevity. Bravo team conducted reconnaissance of suspected enemy supply cache at grid reference November Delta 47829. 1. Team encountered heavy resistance from approximately 30 enemy combatants using crew-served weapons and mortar. 1 friendly casualty, serious but stable. Mission objective achieved through subsequent airstrike. What the report didn't mention was the 47 minutes they'd spent pinned down in that courtyard. 47 minutes of Elena crawling from position to position under enemy fire, treating wounds that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. It didn't mention Tank taking shrapnel in his left arm, or Razor's concussion from a near-miss mortar round, or the way Wire's hands had shaken for hours after they'd finally been extracted. And it certainly didn't mention the conversation Elena had overheard while Ghost was being loaded onto the medevac helicopter. She'd been repacking her medical supplies when she'd heard Sergeant Thompson's voice, low and angry, cutting through the noise of the helicopter's rotors. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Tank had said to someone Elena couldn't see. We had to risk our necks getting her into position. And for what? Ghost would have been just as dead whether she'd been there or not. The response had come. From Rezer, his voice tight with pain from his concussion. Come on, man. She did her job. Her job? Tank's voice had risen enough that Elena could hear every word. Her job is supposed to be keeping us alive, not the other way around. How many times did we have to expose ourselves to cover her movement? How many times did we have to slow down because she couldn't keep up? Elena had frozen at those words, her hands still buried in her medical bag, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with combat stress. She'd wanted to turn around, to confront Tank directly, to demand that he explain exactly how she'd slowed them down or put them at risk. But she'd stayed silent, listening to her teammates discuss her performance as if she weren't 20 feet away. She saved Ghost's life, Wire had said, and Elena had felt a flash of gratitude toward the young radio operator. Maybe, Tank had replied. Or maybe Ghost would have been fine if we'd gotten out of there faster instead of stopping to play doctor in the middle of a firefight. The conversation had ended there, cut short by Morrison's arrival, but the words had lodged themselves in Elena's chest like shrapnel, sharp and persistent and impossible to ignore. Now 12 hours later, she found herself replaying every moment of the engagement, analyzing her decisions, wondering if Tank was right. Had she slowed them down? Had her presence put the team at greater risk? Elena stood up from the folding chair she'd been occupying and walked to the tent's entrance, pushing aside the canvas flap to look out at the base beyond. FOB Chapman was a small outpost in the Paksha province, home to maybe 200 soldiers and contractors who lived and worked in a collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete bunkers, and canvas tents surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home for now, and Elena had learned to appreciate the small comforts it offered: hot meals, actual showers, and beds that didn't require her to sleep with one eye open. She'd been stationed here for 8 months, long enough to know every face, every building, every shortcut between the mess hall and the motor pool. But standing there in the entrance of the medical tent, watching soldiers go about their daily routines, Elena felt more isolated than she had since her first day at the base. The men and women around her were her colleagues, her comrades, the people she'd trained with and fought beside. But they were also strangers in ways that mattered more than shared experience or mutual respect. Elena had grown up understanding that she would have to work twice as hard as anyone else to earn half the recognition. It was a lesson she'd learned from her mother, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse to put herself through school, and from her grandmother, who'd raised 5 children while her husband worked construction jobs that barely paid enough to cover rent. Mia, Abuela Rosa had told her during one of their late-night conversations in the kitchen of their East LA apartment, "The world will try to tell you that you don't belong. They'll say you're too small, too weak, too different. But you know what? The world is wrong. You belong wherever you decide to belong, but only if you're willing to fight for it every single day." Elena had carried those words with her through 4 years of pre-med at UCLA, where she'd been one of only 3 Latina students in her graduating class. She'd carried them through Army basic training, where drill sergeants had tried to break her down and rebuild her into something harder and more resilient. And she'd carried them through Special Forces medical training, where she'd been the only woman in a class of 37 students. But fighting for belonging was exhausting. And there were days like today when Elena wondered if the cost was worth the prize. Her phone buzzed in her cargo pocket, pulling her out of her brooding. She pulled it out and saw a text message from her youngest brother, Miguel, who was a sophomore at USC studying computer engineering. "Hey sis, saw the news about increased fighting in Afghanistan. You okay? Mom's worried." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, trying to figure out how to respond. She could tell him the truth, that she'd spent the morning wondering if her teammates would be safer without her. that she was questioning every decision she'd made during the worst firefight of her career, that she felt more alone than she had since joining the army. But Miguel was 20 years old and had enough to worry about with his studies and his part-time job. He didn't need to carry his sister's doubts along with his own responsibilities. Instead, she typed back, "All good here. Just routine patrols and medical training. Tell Mom I love her." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Elena had become an expert at threading that needle, at sharing enough information to reassure her family without revealing the parts of her job that would keep them awake at night. They knew she was a medic assigned to a special forces unit, but they didn't know about the firefights, the casualties, the moments when she had to choose between saving a life and preserving her own safety. The tent flap rustled behind her, and Elena turned to see Captain Morrison approaching. He looked tired, more tired than she'd ever seen him, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Bird," he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that usually preceded bad news. "We need to talk." Elena nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the medical tent, away from the other medics who were busy with their daily equipment checks and paperwork. Morrison waited until they were alone before speaking again. "I just got off the phone with Colonel Harris," he said. "He wants to see you in his office at 1400 hours. Colonel Harris was the base commander, a career infantry officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for treating his subordinates fairly but firmly. Elena had met him exactly twice since arriving at FOB Chapman, both times during formal briefings that had lasted less than 5 minutes. "Did he say what it was about?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask that officers learn to wear when they had to deliver news they didn't agree with. "He wants to discuss your performance during yesterday's mission, specifically your role in the team's tactical decisions." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "My role in the team's tactical decisions?" "Someone filed a complaint," Morrison said, and his voice carried a note of barely controlled anger. "They're saying you compromised the mission by insisting on treating Ghost instead of following evacuation procedures. They're saying your actions put the entire team at unnecessary risk." Elena stared at him, trying to process what she'd just heard. "Someone filed a complaint? Who?" Morrison shook his head. "You know I can't tell you that, but Elena ... He paused, and for a moment his professional mask slipped, revealing something that looked like genuine concern. "I want you to know that I've submitted my own report, and it tells a very different story. In my opinion, your actions yesterday saved Ghost's life and demonstrated exactly the kind of battlefield judgment we need from our medics. But that's not going to matter if Colonel Harris has already made up his mind, is it?" Elena said. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and his silence was answer enough. Elena spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on routine tasks, inventory checks, equipment maintenance, reviewing medical protocols, but her mind kept drifting to the upcoming meeting with Colonel Harris. She'd been through performance reviews before, both positive and negative, but this felt different. This felt like the kind of conversation that could end her career in Special Forces before it had really begun. At 1350 hours, Elena changed into a fresh uniform and made her way across the base to the administrative building where Colonel Harris had his office. The walk took her past the motor pool, where mechanics worked on vehicles that bore the scars of roadside bombs and small arms fire, past the communications building where intelligence analysts pored over satellite photos and intercepted radio transmissions, past the gym where off-duty soldiers worked out their frustrations on heavy bags and weight machines. It was a world she'd fought to become part of, a world where her skills and dedication should have been more important than her gender or her background. But as she walked toward what might be the end of her time with Bravo Team, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been naive to think that Competence would be enough. The administrative building was a prefabricated structure that housed the base's command staff, intelligence personnel, and clerical workers. Elena had only been inside it a handful of times, and each visit had reinforced her impression that this was where careers were made and broken with the stroke of a pen. Colonel Harris's office was on the second floor, behind a door marked with his name and rank in stenciled letters. Elena knocked and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came the colonel's voice from inside. Elena opened the door and stepped into an office that was larger than she'd expected, but still austere by civilian standards. The walls were lined with maps, photographs, and commendations accumulated over 3 decades of service. Behind a metal desk sat Colonel William Harris, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and a kind of weathered face that spoke of many years spent in places where comfort was a luxury. "Sergeant Vasquez," he said, gesturing to a chair in front of his desk. "Please sit down." Elena sat down and waited, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight in the way that Army training had made automatic. Colonel Harris studied her for a moment, his expression giving away nothing of what he was thinking. "I've been reading the after-action reports from yesterday's mission," he said finally. "Interesting reading." Elena remained silent, having learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "According to Captain Morrison's report," Colonel Harris continued, "you performed your duties with exceptional skill and courage under fire. He specifically mentions your treatment of Corporal Williams, which he believes saved the young man's life." Elena felt a flicker of hope, but she kept her expression neutral. "I did my job, sir." "Yes," Colonel Harris said. "You did, but according to another report I've received, your job performance came at the expense of the team's overall tactical effectiveness. I'm told that you slowed down the team's movement, exposed your teammates to unnecessary risk, and failed to follow established evacuation procedures." The hope Elena had felt a moment earlier evaporated like morning mist. "Sir, with respect, I'd like to know who filed that complaint and what specific actions they're referring to." Colonel Harris leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the kind of attention that made Elena feel like she was under a microscope. "The identity of the complainant isn't relevant to this discussion, Sergeant. What matters is whether there's substance to the allegations." "And what's your assessment, sir?" Colonel Harris was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could hear the muffled sounds of activity from elsewhere in the building, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the Afghan heat. "My assessment," he said finally, "is that you're in a difficult position, Sergeant Vasquez. You're the only woman assigned to a Special Forces unit on this base, which means every decision you make is scrutinized more closely than it would be for your male counterparts. That's not fair, but it's reality." Elena felt a flash of anger at his words, but she kept it out of her voice. "Sir, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be judged by the same standards as everyone else. Are you?" Colonel Harris asked. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're asking to be judged by a higher standard. You're asking me to overlook the concerns of experienced NCOs because your intentions were good." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. "Sir, Colonel Harris held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not finished, Sergeant. Here's what I see when I look at your record. A young woman who scored in the top 5% of her combat medic class, who volunteered for Special Forces assignment despite knowing she'd face additional scrutiny, who has consistently received positive evaluations from her commanding officer." He paused, reaching for a folder on his desk and opening it to reveal what Elena recognized as her personnel file. "I also see someone who's been the subject of 3 informal complaints in 8 months, all related to concerns about team cohesion and tactical effectiveness. Someone who, fairly or unfairly, has become a source of division within a unit that depends on absolute trust and mutual support." Elena felt her heart sink as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Are you transferring me, sir?" Colonel Harris closed the folder and looked directly at her. "I'm giving you a choice, Sergeant. You can request a transfer to a conventional medical unit, where your skills will be valued and your presence won't be a source of controversy. Or you can stay with Bravo Team and understand that your performance will be under constant scrutiny, that every decision you make will be second-guessed, and that one significant mistake could end your career in Special Forces permanently." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. After 8 months of fighting for acceptance, of proving herself over and over again, he was offering her an escape route that would validate every person who'd ever said she didn't belong. "Sir," she said, choosing her words carefully, "what would you do in my position?" Colonel Harris smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office, and there was something in that smile that reminded Elena of her grandfather, who'd spent 40 years working construction in Los Angeles without ever missing a day of work. "Sergeant," he said, "I'd tell anyone who had a problem with my performance to take it up with the enemy. But then again, I've had 30 years to build up enough credibility that people think twice before questioning my judgment." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Take the weekend to think about it. Let me know your decision on Monday morning." Elena stood as well, snapping to attention in the way that had become second nature. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." As she turned to leave, Colonel Harris spoke again. "Sergeant, for what it's worth, Morrison thinks you're one of the finest medics he's ever served with. In my experience, that opinion carries more weight than all the complaints in the world." Elena left the administrative building feeling like she'd just survived another firefight, but this one had been fought with words instead of bullets, and the wounds it had left behind were harder to treat with bandages and morphine. The weekend passed with the sluggish weight of a fever dream. Elena found herself walking the perimeter of Fob Chapman at odd hours, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except Colonel Harris's ultimatum. She had until Monday morning to decide whether to abandon everything she'd worked toward for the past 2 years or to stay and fight for a place she wasn't sure she could ever truly claim. On Saturday evening, she'd tried calling her mother, but the conversation had been stilted and difficult. How could she explain that her lifelong dream of serving with Special Forces was crumbling, not because she lacked the skills or courage, but because some of her teammates couldn't accept her presence? How could she tell the woman who'd worked double shifts to pay for her medical school that she was considering giving up? "Mia," her mother had said during one of the long pauses that punctuated their conversation, "you sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" Elena had looked around her small quarters, a converted shipping container that she shared with a female intelligence analyst, and tried to summon the energy to lie convincingly. "I'm fine, Mama. Just busy with training. You know you can tell me if something's wrong, don't you? I may not understand your work, but I understand you." That had been the moment when Elena almost broke down and told her everything, the complaints, the meetings, the way some of her teammates made her feel like an intruder in her own unit. But she'd held back, unwilling to burden her mother with problems she couldn't solve from 8,000 miles away. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sunday had been worse. Elena had attended the base chapel service, sitting in the back row of folding chairs, while Chaplain Rodriguez delivered a sermon about perseverance in the face of adversity. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the comfort she found in the familiar rituals of her childhood faith. After the service, she'd spent an hour talking with the chaplain, carefully avoiding the specifics of her situation while seeking guidance on how to distinguish between a tactical retreat and surrender. Sometimes, Chaplain Rodriguez had said, the hardest battles are fought not against external enemies, but against our own doubts. The enemy wants us to question our worth, our purpose, our right to stand where God has placed us. Elena had nodded and thanked him for his time, but she'd left the chapel feeling more conflicted than ever. Was this really where God had placed Her, or was she being stubborn in the face of clear evidence that she didn't belong? Monday morning arrived with the relentless inevitability of a tactical assault. Elena dressed carefully in her best uniform, checked and rechecked her appearance in the mirror, and made her way to Colonel Harris's office with the resignation letter she'd written and rewritten a dozen times over the weekend, but she never made it to the administrative building. At 0627 hours, the base's alarm system started wailing, and Elena's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from the Tactical Operations Center. All medical personnel to Staging Area Alpha. We have multiple incoming casualties from Operation Redwood. 15 minutes. Elena felt her training take over, muscle memory overriding her emotional turmoil as she sprinted toward the medical tent. The resignation letter crumpled in her cargo pocket, forgotten in the face of immediate need. Whatever else was happening in her career, wounded soldiers were incoming, and that was the only thing that mattered. The medical tent was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Major Patricia Wells, the base's chief medical officer, was coordinating with the helicopter pilots while other medics prepared trauma bays and checked equipment. Elena could see the organized chaos that preceded mass casualty events, the controlled urgency that separated military medicine from its civilian counterpart. "Vasquez," Major Wells called out as Elena grabbed her gear. "You're with Trauma Bay 3. We've got at least 6 critical coming in, possible casualties from an IED strike on a convoy patrol." Elena nodded and moved to her assigned station, her hands automatically going through the familiar ritual of checking supplies and equipment. Morphine, check. Hemostatic agents, check. Chest tubes, check. Blood pressure cuffs, tourniquets, intubation kit, everything she might need to keep someone alive long enough for definitive care. The sound of incoming helicopters grew louder, the distinctive whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through the morning air. Elena could see dust clouds forming on the landing zone as the first medevac bird touched down, its crew already moving to unload stretchers and walking wounded, the first casualty they brought to Elena's station was a young private she didn't recognize, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. He'd taken shrapnel in his left leg and arm, wounds that were serious but not life-threatening. Elena worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning and dressing the wounds while providing reassurance and pain medication. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked as she worked. "Private Johnson, ma'am." "Tyler Johnson." His voice was tight with pain and shock, but his eyes were alert and focused. "Well, Tyler, you're going to be fine. These wounds look worse than they are. You'll be back on duty in a few weeks, probably with some impressive scars to show off." Elena had learned that humor, when appropriately applied, could be more effective than morphine for treating shock and anxiety. She'd seen soldiers rally from serious wounds when they believed their medic was confident and in control. The second casualty was more challenging, a staff sergeant with a penetrating abdominal wound that had Elena's full attention. She started in 4, administered pain medication, and prepared the man for immediate surgery while coordinating with Major Wells about surgical priorities. That it was during the treatment of the third casualty that Elena's world shifted again. The stretcher. Bearers brought in a soldier whose face was obscured by bandages, but Elena recognized the voice immediately. "Doc Bird," the voice said, weak but unmistakable. "That you?" Elena looked down at the stretcher and felt her heart stop. It was Ghost Corporal Danny Williams, the same soldier she'd treated during the firefight at the school compound 3 days earlier. He was supposed to be in Germany receiving specialized treatment for his chest wound, not lying on a stretcher at Phoebe Chapman with fresh injuries. "Ghost, what the hell are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Landstuhl." Ghost managed a weak smile despite the pain medication coursing through his system. Medical transport got diverted due to weather. Was stuck at Bagram for 2 days. Finally caught a ride back here this morning. Elena was already assessing his new injuries while trying to make sense of what he was telling her. In addition to his healing chest wound, Ghost now had burns on his hands and face, consistent with being inside a vehicle when an IED exploded. "The convoy you were traveling with?" she asked. "Hit a pressure plate IED about 10 clicks from base. I was riding in the second vehicle, took most of the blast wave, but missed the worst of it." Ghost paused, his breathing labored. "Doc, there's something you need to know. About the other day, at the school." Elena continued working as she listened, cleaning the burns on his hands with practiced efficiency. "What about it?" "Tank and some of the others, they've been saying things. About how you slowed us down, how we could have gotten out faster if—" Ghost stopped, wincing as Elena applied antiseptic to a particularly deep burn. "I know," Elena said quietly. "I heard some of it. Well, they're wrong." Ghost's voice was getting stronger, fueled by something that looked like anger. "You want to know why I'm still alive? It's not because of the medevac helicopter or the surgeons in Germany. It's because you knew exactly what you were doing in that courtyard. You bought me the time I needed." Elena looked up from his wounds, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd been brought in. "Ghost, no, let me finish. I've been thinking about this for 3 days. You had 2 choices in that courtyard: follow evacuation protocol and drag me to the extraction point, probably watching me bleed out along the way, or stay and fight for my life right there, under fire. You chose to fight." Ghost struggled to sit up slightly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Tank and the others, they think following protocol is always the right answer. But protocol doesn't account for everything. Sometimes you need someone who's willing to improvise, to take risks, to care more about saving lives than following rules." Before Elena could respond, Major Wells appeared at her station. "Vasquez, how's your patient?" "Second-degree burns on hands and face, possible concussion, but he's stable. The chest wound from his previous injury is healing well, signs of reopening or infection." Major Wells nodded and moved on to check the other trauma bays, but not before Elena caught something in her expression: approval, maybe, or respect. It was the kind of look Elena had been hoping to see from her teammates for 8 months. As Elena finished treating Ghost's burns, she became aware of activity at the tent's entrance. Captain Morrison had arrived, along with Tank and Razor, both of whom looked like they'd been through their own version of hell. Their uniforms were dusty and torn, and Tank had a fresh bandage on his forehead. Elena's stomach tightened as she realized what this meant. If Morrison and his team were here, if they'd been involved in the same convoy that had brought Ghost back to base, then something had gone very wrong with what should have been a routine transport mission. Morrison approached her station with the grim expression Elena had learned to associate with bad news. "Berg, we need to talk. When you're finished with Williams." Elena applied the final dressing to Ghost's burns and signaled for the orderlies to transport him to the recovery area. As they wheeled him away, Ghost caught her hand and squeezed it weakly. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Elena watched him go, then turned to face Morrison and whatever news had brought that expression to his face. Behind him, Tank and Razor waited with the kind of uncomfortable body language that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. "What happened out there?" Elena asked. Morrison ran a hand through his hair, leaving tracks in the dust and sweat that covered his scalp. "The convoy Ghost was traveling with got hit by a complex ambushide followed by small arms fire. We were providing escort for the final 10 kilometers when the attack started." Elena nodded, understanding the tactical situation immediately. Convoy escorts were routine missions, the kind of thing that special forces units handled when they weren't engaged in direct action operations. But routine didn't mean safe, especially on roads that insurgents had been mining and targeting for over a decade. "How many casualties?" she asked. 4 wounded, no K, thanks to some quick thinking by the vehicle commanders. But Elena ... Morrison paused, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "There's something else. Colonel Harris was in the convoy," Elena felt the world tilt slightly around her. The colonel, is he? He's fine. Minor cuts and bruises, nothing serious. But he saw everything that happened during the engagement, including the way Tank and Razor performed under fire. Elena looked over at Tank and Razor, both of whom were suddenly very interested in the floor of the medical tent. There was something in their posture, shame, maybe, or embarrassment, that made Elena's pulse quicken. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. Morrison glanced around the tent, making sure they couldn't be overheard, then lowered his voice. "During the engagement, we had 2 soldiers go down with heat exhaustion. The temperature hit 118 degrees, and they'd been in full gear for 6 hours. Tank and Razor both froze up, couldn't figure out how to treat the symptoms, couldn't make the basic decisions that might have prevented the situation from getting worse." Elena stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. Tank and Razor were experienced NCOs with years of combat experience. The idea that they'd freeze up during a medical emergency seemed impossible. "I don't understand," she said. "They've never had to handle serious medical situations without you," Morrison continued. "For 8 months, they've gotten used to having someone else make the hard calls, someone else take responsibility for keeping people alive. When that someone wasn't there." Morrison didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Elena could see the implications clearly enough. Tank finally looked up from the floor, his face flushed with something that might have been anger or embarrassment. "Look, it's not that we can't handle basic first aid. It's just that in the middle of a firefight, with wounded guys screaming and bullets flying, it's hard to think straight." "That's exactly when you need to think straight," Elena said, and she heard an edge in her voice that surprised her. "That's exactly when lives depend on someone staying calm and focused." "Easy for you to say," Tank shot back. "You've been training for this your whole career. Some of us came up through the ranks doing other jobs." Elena felt 8 months of accumulated frustration finally reach its breaking point. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't feel the pressure every time someone gets hurt? You think I don't wonder if I'm making the right decisions?" She stepped closer to Tank, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "But you know what? I don't have the luxury of freezing up. I don't have the luxury of waiting for someone else to make the hard calls. Because if I fail, people die. And if people die because I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or fast enough, then I have to live with that for the rest of my life." Tank started to respond, but Elena wasn't finished. "You want to know why I slowed down the evacuation at the school? Because Ghost was bleeding to death, and moving him without stabilizing his wounds would have killed him. You want to know why I exposed myself to enemy fire? Because that's what medics do. We run toward danger instead of away from it." Elena could feel her voice rising, could see other medical personnel starting to pay attention to the conversation, but she couldn't stop herself. "For 8 months, I've listened to you, and others call me burden when you thought I couldn't hear. For 8 months, I've had to prove myself over and over again while you got to coast on your reputations. And now you're telling me that, when push came to shove, when soldiers needed medical care and I wasn't there to provide it, you froze up?" Tank's face had gone from red to white, and Elena could see something in his eyes that looked like recognition or maybe shame. "Elena," Morrison started, but she cut him off. "No, sir. I'm tired of being polite about this. I'm tired of pretending. That competence is enough when some people have already decided that I don't belong here." Elena looked directly at Tank and Razor. "You want to file complaints about my performance? Fine. But maybe you should spend less time worrying about whether I'm slowing you down and more time learning how to save lives without me." The tent had gone completely silent. Elena could see Major Wells watching from across the room, could feel the attention of every medic and orderly within earshot. She just committed what might be career suicide, chewing out 2 senior NCOs in front of witnesses. But for the first time in months, Elena didn't care about the consequences. Morrison was the first to break the silence. "Tank, Reza, get cleaned up and report for debriefing at 1400. We'll finish this conversation later." Both men nodded and left the tent without another word, but not before Elena caught something in Tank's expression that she'd never seen before. Respect. Morrison waited until they were gone before speaking again. "Feel better?" Elena considered the question seriously. "Actually, yes, I do." "Good, because Colonel Harris wants to see you in his office at 1600 hours. He witnessed the whole convoy engagement, including Tank and Razor's performance. I think your meeting is going to go very differently than you expected." Elena looked down at her hands, which were still stained with Ghost's blood from treating his burns. She thought about the resignation letter in her cargo pocket, about the decision she'd been struggling with all weekend, about the conversation with Colonel Harris that had been weighing on her mind for 3 days. "Captain," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." Morrison nodded. "Shoot, do you really think I belong here? Not because you want to support me or because you feel sorry for me, but because you honestly believe I make this team better?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him considering his answer carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of conviction that couldn't be faked. "Elena, in 15 years of Special Forces operations, I've served with a lot of medics. Good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. You want to know what makes you different?" Elena nodded. "Most medics, even the good ones, see their job as damage control, patch people up, keep them alive long enough to get to a real hospital. You see your job as actually healing people, as taking responsibility for their complete recovery." Morrison paused, looking around the medical tent where Elena had just saved lives under pressure. When Ghost got shot at the school, any competent medic could have stopped the bleeding and gotten him to the helicopter. But you didn't just stop the bleeding. You made sure he was stable enough that the transport wouldn't kill him. You made decisions in that courtyard that saved his life, not just prolonged his death. Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Elena could hear. "And today, when Tank and Razor froze up during the convoy attack, it wasn't because they're cowards or incompetent. It was because they've spent 8 months learning to depend on someone who's better at this job than they'll ever be. That's not a weakness on their part. That's a testament to your skill." Elena felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, like a knot finally coming undone. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. You still have to face Colonel Harris, and after that performance in the convoy, he's got some hard questions about team dynamics and leadership." Elena pulled the resignation letter from her cargo pocket and looked at it. For a moment, 3 pages of carefully worded paragraphs that would have ended her Special Forces career before it had really begun. Then she tore it in half and dropped the pieces in a nearby trash can. "I guess I'll have to answer those questions," she said. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him since the firefight at the school. "That's my medic. Now go get cleaned up. You've got a meeting with the colonel, and something tells me you're going to want to look your best." As Elena walked back to her quarters to change uniforms, she found herself thinking about a conversation she'd had with her grandmother just before leaving for Afghanistan. They'd been sitting on the front porch of the house in East LA where Elena had grown up, watching the sun set behind the downtown skyline. "Abuela," Elena had said, "what if I'm not strong enough for this? What if I get there and find out I can't do the job?" Rosa Vasquez had been quiet for a long time, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 93 years of experience. "Mia, strength isn't about never being afraid. Strength is about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. The oak tree doesn't bend because it's weak, it bends because it's smart enough to know the difference between yielding and breaking." Now, walking across Fob Chapman toward what might be the most important meeting of her military career, Elena finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her. She'd spent 8 months trying to prove that she was strong enough to stand rigid against every challenge, every doubt, every criticism. But maybe real strength was knowing when to bend without breaking, when to fight, and when to adapt. The resignation letter was gone, torn up and thrown away like the doubts that had written it. Whatever Colonel Harris wanted to discuss, whatever questions he had about her performance and her place on Bravo team, Elena would face them with the knowledge that she belonged here, not because she was perfect, but because she was necessary. And sometimes being necessary was more important than being accepted. At exactly 1600 hours, Elena knocked on Colonel Harris's office door for the second time in 3 days. But this time, she wasn't carrying a resignation letter in her pocket, and she wasn't walking into the meeting with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. "Enter," came the colonel's voice from inside. Elena opened the door and stepped into the office, snapping to attention with the crisp precision that had become second nature during her military training. Colonel Harris was behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Captain Morrison sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, and in the other chair, to Elena's surprise, sat Major Patricia Wells, the base's chief medical officer. "Sergeant Vasquez." Colonel Harris said, "Please have a seat." Elena remained standing. "Sir, if it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to remain at attention." Colonel Harris studied her face for a moment, and Elena thought she detected the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "As you wish, Sergeant, but this might take a while." "I'm prepared for that, sir. I'm sure you are." Colonel Harris opened the folder on his desk, the same personnel file Elena had seen during their previous meeting, but it was noticeably thicker now. "Sergeant, I've received several new reports about your performance since we last spoke. Some of them confirm what we discussed on Friday. Others—" he paused, looking up at her. "Others paint a very different picture." Elena remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Major Wells, would you like to start?" Major Wells shifted in her chair, turning slightly to face Elena directly. "Sergeant Vasquez, I've been watching your work for 8 months now, and I have to say that today's performance during the mass casualty event was exceptional. You treated 6 wounded soldiers with a level of skill and composure that I've rarely seen from medics with twice your experience." Elena felt a flutter of surprise, but kept it out of her expression. "Thank you, ma'am. But more importantly," Major Wells continued, "you demonstrated exactly the kind of battlefield judgment that separates good medics from great ones. The decision you made regarding Corporal Williams's treatment, prioritizing stabilization over rapid evacuation, was medically sound and ultimately saved his life." Elena allowed herself a moment of relief, but she could sense that this conversation was just beginning. Colonel Harris picked up where Major Wells had left off. "Captain Morrison has also submitted an additional report based on today's convoy engagement, Captain." Morrison turned in his chair to look at Elena directly. "Elena, I want you to know that what I'm about to say is going into your official record, and it represents my honest assessment of your value to this unit." Elena nodded, feeling her pulse quicken. "In my 15 years of Special Forces operations, I've never seen a medic who could make the kinds of instantaneous decisions under fire that you made at the school compound. But more than that, I've never seen a medic whose presence elevated the performance of an entire team the way yours does." Elena blinked, trying to process what Morrison had just said. "Sir, today's convoy engagement proved something that I've suspected for months, but never had the opportunity to document. When you're not with the team, when my NCOs have to handle medical emergencies on their own, their performance degrades significantly. Not because they lack basic training, but because they've become accustomed to working with someone who operates at a level they can't match." Morrison stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the base beyond. "Tank Thompson is one of the finest heavy weapon specialists I've ever served with. He can call in accurate fire support under conditions that would break most soldiers. But when 2 men went down with heat exhaustion during today's engagement, he couldn't make the basic medical decisions that might have prevented the situation from becoming critical. Elena felt her understanding of the situation shift again, like pieces of a puzzle suddenly snapping into place. The complaints about your performance, Morrison continued, weren't really about your performance at all. They were about fear. That my NCOs had become dependent on skills they didn't possess. Fear that their own limitations were being exposed by your competence. Colonel Harris leaned forward in his chair. Sergeant Vasquez, are you familiar with the concept of force multiplication? Yes, sir. It refers to capabilities that allow a smaller unit to achieve effects typically associated with larger units. Exactly. And after reviewing all the reports from the past 3 days, it's become clear that you represent a significant force multiplier for Bravo Team. Your medical skills allow the team to take on missions with acceptable risk levels that would be unacceptable without your presence. Elena felt her world tilting again, but this time in a direction she hadn't expected. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Colonel Harris stood up and walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of Elena. What I'm saying, Sergeant, is that the complaints about your performance were misguided at best and potentially damaging to unit effectiveness at worst. What I'm saying is that Bravo Team needs you more than you need them. Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this assessment with everything she'd been told over the past 3 days. Sir, with respect, Sergeant Thompson and the others seemed to believe that my presence was compromising the team's tactical effectiveness. Sergeant Thompson, Colonel Harris said, and his voice carried a note of steel that Elena had never heard before, will be receiving additional medical training over the next 6 weeks, as will Sergeant Martinez and every other NCO in this unit, who thinks that medical skills are optional for Special Forces personnel. Elena felt her mouth open slightly before she caught herself. Additional training, sir. Major Wells spoke up. Elena, one of the things we've learned from today's events is that our NCOs have been relying too heavily on embedded medical personnel instead of maintaining their own emergency medical skills. That's a training deficiency that needs to be corrected. But more than that, Colonel Harris added, it's become clear that some members of this unit have been treating you as a subordinate specialist rather than as a critical team member whose input should be valued and whose decisions should be trusted. Elena felt something that had been tight in her chest for months finally begin to relax. Sir, are you saying that the complaints against me are being withdrawn? Colonel Harris interrupted. Sergeant Thompson came to see me this afternoon. He wanted to formally retract his previous statements and offer a public apology for his assessment of your performance. Elena stared at him. He did? Morrison turned back from the window. Elena, after what happened during the convoy engagement, Tank realized that his problems weren't with your performance. They were with his own insecurities about medical situations. He spent 2 hours this afternoon going through every engagement we've had over the past 8 months, documenting every time your medical intervention made the difference between mission success and mission failure. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back with conscious effort. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Colonel Harris said. But you do need to listen, because I have something important to tell you. Elena straightened. Even further, if that was possible. Sergeant Vasquez, effective immediately, you're being promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant. Furthermore, you're being assigned as the senior medical NCO for all Special Forces operations conducted out of this base. Elena felt the world stop around her. Sir? The promotion comes with a significant increase in responsibility, Colonel Harris continued. You'll be responsible for training all embedded medics assigned to Special Forces units. You'll have input on mission planning from a medical perspective, and you'll be authorized to override tactical decisions if medical considerations require it. Elena tried to speak but found that her voice had stopped working entirely. Major. Wells stood up and approached Elena with something in her hand, a small black box that Elena recognized as containing new rank insignia. Elena, Major Wells said, "There's something else you need to know. The medical treatment you provided to Corporal Williams at the school compound didn't just save his life, it prevented the kind of complications that could have left him permanently disabled. According to the surgeons in Germany, your field stabilization was textbook perfect." Elena finally found her voice. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job." "No," Morrison said firmly. "You were doing your job exceptionally well under impossible conditions. There's a difference." Colonel Harris moved back to his desk and picked up a sheet of paper that Elena hadn't noticed before. "There's one more thing, Staff Sergeant. I've submitted a recommendation that you be awarded the Bronze Star Medal for your actions during the engagement at the school compound." Elena felt her knees go weak. "Sir, the medal recognizes meritorious service in a combat zone, Colonel." Harris continued. "Specifically, it recognizes your willingness to expose yourself to enemy fire in order to provide life-saving medical treatment to a wounded teammate." Elena looked around the room at the three officers who had just turned her world upside down. 3 days ago, she'd been considering resigning from Special Forces rather than continue fighting for acceptance. Now she was being promoted and recommended for one of the Army's highest decorations. "Sir," she said, "I need to ask you something." Colonel Harris nodded. "Go ahead. What changed?" 3 days ago, you were offering me a choice between transferring out or staying under constant scrutiny. Now you're promoting me and recommending me for a medal." Colonel Harris smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "What changed, Staff Sergeant, is that we got a chance to see what happens when you're not there to pick up the slack. What changed is that some people finally realized that their problems weren't with your performance, they were with their own inadequacies." Morrison stepped forward. "Elena, there's something Tank wanted me to tell you. He said that watching you work today, seeing how you handled multiple casualties under pressure, while keeping your cool and making good decisions, made him realize that he'd been judging you by the wrong standards." Elena felt confused. "The wrong standards?" "He'd been comparing your performance to what he thought a typical medic should be able to do," Morrison explained. "He didn't realize that you weren't performing like a typical medic, you were performing like the best medic he'd ever seen." Major Wells held out the box containing Elena's new rank insignia. "Elena, would you like me to pin these on, or would you prefer to wait for a formal ceremony?" Elena looked down at the box, then back up at the three officers who had just changed her life. "Ma'am, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to wait until I can call my family. My grandmother would never forgive me if she missed this." "Colonel." Harris laughed the first time Elena had heard him laugh since arriving at Fob Chapman. "Staff Sergeant, take all the time you need. But I want you to know that this promotion isn't just about recognizing your past performance. It's about acknowledging your potential for future leadership." Elena felt a question forming and decided to voice it. "Sir, what does this mean for my assignment to Bravo Team?" "It means," Morrison said, "that you're no longer assigned to Bravo Team as an embedded medic. You're assigned as Bravo Team's Senior Medical NCO, which means you have equal authority with the other team leaders when it comes to mission planning and tactical decisions." Elena tried to process what this meant. Instead of being the team's medic, subject to the decisions of senior NCOs, she would be one of the senior NCOs, with authority over medical matters that extended beyond basic field treatment. "Furthermore," Colonel Harris added, "you'll be working with Major Wells to develop new training protocols for Special Forces medical personnel. We want to make sure that what happened to day NCOs freezing up during medical emergencies never happens again." Elena felt a sense of purpose settling over her like a comfortable weight. This wasn't just about recognition for past performance. It was about using her skills and experience to make sure other soldiers received the kind of medical care that could save their lives. "Sir," she said, "I have one more question." "Colonel." Harris nodded. "What about the other members of Bravo team? How are they going to feel about taking orders from someone they were calling Burden 3 days ago?" Morrison and Colonel Harris exchanged a look that Elena couldn't quite interpret. "That's something you'll have to work out with them directly," Morrison said. "But I think you'll find that today's events have changed their perspective significantly." As if summoned by their conversation, there was a knock on Colonel Harris's office door. "Enter," the colonel called out. The door opened, and Tank Thompson stepped into the office. He was clean-shaven and wearing a fresh uniform, but Elena could see something in his expression that she'd never seen before, something that looked like humility. "Sir," Tank said, addressing Colonel Harris, "you said Staff Sergeant Vasquez would be here. I was hoping I could speak with her." Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for months, a direct confrontation with the person who'd been most vocal about her presence on the team. "Go ahead, Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Harris said. Tank turned to face Elena directly, and she could see him gathering his courage for whatever he was about to say. "Elena," he began, and the use of her first name was so unexpected that Elena felt herself blink in surprise. "I owe you an apology. Not just for the complaint I filed, but for the way I've treated you since you joined the team." Elena remained at attention, waiting for him to continue. "Today, when those 2 soldiers went down with heat exhaustion, I realized something that I should have figured out months ago. I realized that I'd been so focused on maintaining my own position as a senior NCO that I never bothered to learn from someone who could have made me better at my job." Tank paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded Elena of Morrison. "You want to know the truth? I was threatened by you, not because you're a woman, not because you're young, but because you're better at the medical side of this job than I'll ever be. And instead of admitting that and trying to learn from you, I convinced myself that the problem was your presence on the team." Elena felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Tank, let me finish," Tank said. "Today, when I froze up, when I couldn't make the basic decisions that might have saved those soldiers from serious complications, I realized that my ego had been putting lives at risk. Your ego never put anyone at risk, mine did." Tank stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Elena could hear. "Elena, I want you to know that if you'll have me, I'd like to request assignment as your assistant for medical operations. I want to learn how to do this job the way you do it." Elena stared at him, trying to process this complete reversal of everything she'd expected from this conversation. "Tank," she said, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Tank interrupted. "Because the next time we're in a firefight and someone gets hurt, I want to be able to help instead of getting in the way. I want to be the kind of NCO who makes you better instead of holding you back." Elena looked around the room at Colonel Harris, Morrison, and Major Wells, all of whom were watching this exchange with expressions of approval and something that looked like relief. "Tank," she said finally, "I'd be honored to have you as my assistant." Tank smiled, the first genuine smile Elena had ever seen from him. "Thank you. And Elena, I want you to know that from now on, anyone who calls you Burden will have to answer to me." Elena felt tears threatening again and decided that for once, she didn't care who saw them. "Actually," she said, "I think I'm going to keep the call. Sign Bird, it's grown on me." Tank laughed. "Bird it is. Staff Sergeant Bird." As Elena left Colonel Harris's office an hour later, she found herself thinking about a conversation she'd had with her youngest brother just before deploying to Afghanistan. Miguel had been worried about her safety, worried about her ability to fit in with a special forces unit, worried that she was taking on more than she could handle. "Sis," he'd said, "what if they don't accept you? What if you go all that way and find out you don't belong?" Elena had given him the answer she thought he wanted to hear, something about proving herself through hard work and dedication. Something about earning respect through competence and professionalism. But now, walking across Phoebe Chapman with new rank insignia in her pocket and the weight of real responsibility on her shoulders, Elena realized that she'd been thinking about the whole situation wrong. She'd spent 8 months trying to earn acceptance from people whose opinion ultimately didn't matter as much as her own sense of purpose. She belonged here not because Tank Thompson had finally accepted her, not because Colonel Harris had promoted her, and not because Major Wells had praised her performance. She belonged here because wounded soldiers needed someone who could save their lives under impossible conditions, and she was one of the few people in the world who could do that job. The difference between belonging and being accepted, Elena realized, was the difference between external validation and internal purpose. She'd spent 8 months seeking the former, when she should have been focused on the latter. Her phone buzzed with a text message as she reached her quarters. It was from Ghost, who was apparently recovered enough to use his phone despite the burns on his hands. Bird heard about the promotion. About damn time. Also heard Tank is requesting medical cross-training. Maybe there's hope for him after all. Elena smiled and typed back, "Thanks, Ghost. How are you feeling?" "Like I got blown up twice in 1 week. But alive thanks to you." "Elena, I want you to know something. What you did at the school, what you did today, that's the reason some of us get to go home to our families. Don't ever let anyone tell you that doesn't matter." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something settle in her chest that felt like peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of certainty about her place in the world. That evening, Elena finally made the phone call she'd been putting off all day. She sat on her narrow bunk in the converted shipping container that served as her quarters, looking at her grandmother's contact information on her phone screen, trying to figure out how to explain everything that had happened. The phone rang 3 times before her grandmother's voice came through the speaker, warm and familiar and carrying the slight accent that reminded Elena of childhood afternoons in East LA. "Mia, I was just thinking about you. How are you?" Elena smiled, realizing that for the first time in months, she could answer that question honestly. "I'm good, Abuela. Really good. I have some news. Tell me." Elena took a deep breath and began to explain about the promotion, the medal recommendation, and the new responsibilities that came with her changed status. As she talked, she could hear her grandmother making small sounds of approval and pride that transported Elena back to childhood, back to kitchen conversations over café con leche and homemade tortillas. "Ay, Mia," her grandmother said when Elena finished. "I knew this day would come. From the time you were little, you had hands that could heal. I could see it when you would bandage your dolls, when you would take care of your brothers when they got hurt." Elena felt tears in her eyes again. "Abuela, there were times when I wasn't sure I was strong enough for this job." "Strength," her grandmother said, and Elena could hear the wisdom of 93 years in her voice, "is not about never bending. The oak tree bends in the storm, but it doesn't break. You have learned to bend without breaking, and that is the strongest thing of all." Elena nodded, even though her grandmother couldn't see her. "I think I'm starting to understand that. And your teammates? The ones who didn't trust you?" Elena thought about Tank's apology, about Morrison's assessment, about the way Colonel Harris had looked at her when he announced her promotion. "I think they're starting to understand it, too." After she hung up the phone, Elena sat in the quiet of her quarters for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 months ago, she'd arrived at FOB Chapman with nothing but her medical training and a determination to prove herself worthy of serving with Special Forces. Now she was a staff sergeant with authority over medical operations and the respect of people whose opinions actually mattered. But more than that, she was someone who understood the difference between seeking acceptance and claiming belonging. She was someone who had learned that real strength came not from never being challenged, but from rising to meet every challenge with courage and skill. Elena opened her laptop and began typing her first report as a staff sergeant, comprehensive assessment of Special Forces medical training needs based on the events of the past 3 days. It was work that mattered, work that would save lives, work that reminded her why she'd chosen this path in the first place. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of O.B. Chapman settling into evening routine generators humming, vehicles moving between buildings, the distant sound of soldiers laughing at something on television. It was the soundtrack of a military base in a combat zone, and it had become as familiar to Elena as the sound of traffic in Los Angeles or mariachi music from the neighbor's radio. This was home now, not because it was comfortable or safe or easy, but because it was where her skills and dedication could make the biggest difference. It was where she belonged. Elena worked on her report until well past midnight, fueled by purpose and the knowledge that every recommendation she made, every protocol she developed, every training standard she established could be the difference between a soldier going home to his family or not going home at all. As she finally prepared for sleep, Elena thought about the letter she'd almost submitted to Colonel Harris, the resignation that would have ended her Special Forces career before it had really begun. She was grateful now that the convoy attack had interrupted her plans, grateful that circumstances had forced her to confront her doubts instead of surrendering to them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to prove that she belonged exactly where she was. But tonight, Elena Vasquez fell asleep with the rank of staff sergeant on her collar and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 6 months later, Elena stood in the briefing room at Phoebe Chapman, looking out at a classroom filled with 24 Special Forces medics from across Afghanistan. They were all experienced combat veterans, all highly trained professionals, but they were here because the medical training protocols Elena had developed had been adopted by Special Operations Command and were now required for all embedded medical personnel. The difference between a good medic and a great medic, Elena told the assembled students, isn't technical knowledge, though that's important. It's the ability to make life or death decisions under fire while maintaining the kind of calm that keeps your teammates focused on their jobs instead of worried about their casualties. Elena clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a tactical diagram of the school compound where Ghost had been wounded 8 months earlier. It had become a case study in combat medical decision-making, used in training programs, from Fort Bragg to Coronado. In this scenario, Elena continued, conventional medical protocol called for immediate evacuation to a secure location before beginning treatment. But sometimes conventional protocol doesn't account for the reality of battlefield conditions. A hand went up in the back of the room. Staff Sergeant, how do you make the decision to deviate from established protocol? What if you're wrong? Elena smiled, recognizing the question as one she'd asked herself countless times during her early days with Bravo Team. The decision to deviate from protocol should never be made lightly, she said. But sometimes the greater risk is following protocol blindly instead of adapting to circumstances. In this case, moving the casualty without stabilization would have resulted in fatal blood loss during transport. Another hand went up. What about the tactical situation? How do you balance medical priorities against operational security? That's where the embedded medic's role has evolved, Elena replied. As senior medical NCOs, we're not just responsible for treating casualties, we're responsible for making tactical recommendations that optimize both medical and operational outcomes. Elena clicked to another slide, this one showing statistics from Special Forces medical operations over the past 6 months. The numbers told a story that she was particularly proud of. Casualty survival rates had improved by 18%. Mission abort rates due to medical complications had dropped by 23%, and the average time for medical evacuation had decreased by 12 minutes. These improvements didn't come from new equipment or better helicopters, Elena explained. They came from better training, better decision-making, and better integration between medical personnel and tactical teams. As the class broke for lunch, Elena found herself thinking about how much had changed since that morning, when she'd almost submitted her resignation. The medical training program she now ran was just one part of a broader transformation in how Special Operations Command approached battlefield medicine. Elena had been promoted to Sergeant First Class 3 months earlier, making her one of the youngest senior NCOs in Special Forces. More importantly, she'd been selected to lead a new joint task force developing medical protocols for high-risk operations across all branches of Special Operations. But the changes went beyond her own career. Progression. Tank Thompson had completed his medical cross-training and was now serving as Elena's deputy instructor, teaching other NCOs the basics of combat medicine. Razor Martinez had requested additional medical training and was working toward certification as a combat lifesaver instructor. Even Wire Jackson had completed an advanced first aid course and was spreading medical knowledge throughout the communications community. Most significantly, the culture within Special Forces units had begun to shift. Medical personnel were no longer seen as support staff who could be ignored during mission planning. They were recognized as essential team members, whose input could mean the difference between mission success and mission failure. Elena's radio crackled as she walked across the base toward the mess hall. "Bird, this is Palhorse 6. Request your presence at the Operations Center for mission briefing." Elena pressed the transmit button on her radio. "Palhorse 6, Bird. En route." The Operations Center was a secure facility where mission planning and intelligence analysis took place. Elena had been spending more time there lately, as her role had expanded to include input on mission planning from a medical perspective. When she arrived, she found Colonel Harris, Morrison, and several other officers gathered around a large table covered with maps and satellite photographs. In the center of the table was an image that made Elena's pulse quicken, an overhead view of a compound in the mountains that looked eerily similar to the school where she'd first proven herself under fire. "Bird," Colonel Harris said as she entered the room, "we have a situation. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target is being held at this location." He pointed to the satellite image, along with approximately 15 Taliban fighters and an unknown number of civilians. Elena studied the photograph, noting the tactical challenges immediately. The compound was located in difficult terrain with limited approach routes and no obvious landing zones for helicopter insertion. "What's the medical assessment, sir?" Elena asked. Morrison stepped forward. "That's why you're here. This is going to be a high-risk operation with potential for significant casualties. We need your recommendation on medical support requirements." Elena moved closer to the table, studying the terrain and the compound layout with an eye toward casualty evacuation and treatment under fire. "How many operators?" she asked. 12, Morrison replied. "Bravo team plus an additional squad for security." Elena nodded, running calculations in her head. "I'll need a minimum of 2 medics on the assault team, plus a combat surgeon standing by at the forward operating base. Given the terrain and the distance from definitive care, I'd also recommend pre-positioning blood products and a trauma team at the closest secure landing zone." Colonel Harris leaned forward. "What about risks? What are the medical factors that could compromise the mission?" Elena pointed to several locations on the satellite image. "The compound is surrounded by high ground, which means limited cover during evacuation. If we take casualties, extraction could be extremely difficult. The nearest trauma hospital is 45 minutes by helicopter, which means we need to be prepared for definitive care on site." She paused, considering the tactical implications of what she was seeing. "Sir, from a medical perspective, this operation carries significant risk. But with proper planning and adequate medical support, those risks can be managed." Colonel Harris nodded. And if I told you that the intelligence indicates the target might be moved within the next 48 hours? Elena understood immediately. Time constraints meant fewer options for medical support, higher risks, and less margin for error. In that case, sir, I'd recommend that I lead the medical team personally. This operation is going to require the kind of real-time medical decision-making that can't be delegated. Morrison looked up from the map. Elena, this isn't a Bravo team operation. You don't have to, with respect, sir, Elena interrupted. Medical support for high-risk operations is exactly what I've been training for. This is my job. Colonel. Harris studied her face for a long moment, and Elena could see him weighing the risks of including her in the operation against the risks of proceeding without adequate medical leadership. Very well, he said finally. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, you'll serve as Senior Medical Officer for Operation Thunderbolt. Mission briefing is at 06:00 tomorrow. As Elena left the operations center, she found herself thinking about the circular nature of military service. 8 months after almost resigning because she felt like she didn't belong, she was volunteering for one of the most dangerous missions of her career. But this time, she wasn't fighting for acceptance. She was fighting because her skills were needed and because she was the best person for the job. This is the inspiring conclusion to Elena Vasquez's remarkable military journey. Spanning from a determined young medic to a decorated lieutenant colonel who revolutionized special operations medicine, the story picks up as Elena prepares for a dangerous mission. Having transformed from someone desperately seeking acceptance to a confident leader integral to her team's success. Her journey culminates in Operation Thunderbolt, where she leads the medical component of a joint special forces operation, demonstrating how far she's traveled from her early days of proving herself worthy. 3 years later, Major Elena addresses an auditorium of elite military personnel, sharing how her experiences led to fundamental changes in battlefield medicine. Her innovations improved casualty survival rates by 32% and reduced medical evacuation times across special operations. Command. What began as a personal struggle for belonging became a catalyst for saving countless lives. Elena's career trajectory accelerates when she's offered command of medical operations for Joint Task Force Prometheus, leading high-risk missions in denied areas. Her grandmother's wisdom about oak trees bending, but not breaking, continues to guide her through increasingly challenging assignments. The story reaches its pinnacle 5 years later at Walter Reed Medical Center, where Lieutenant Colonel Elena receives the Legion of Merit from the Secretary of Defense. Surrounded by her proud family, including her 99-year-old grandmother, Elena reflects on a journey from the barrios of East Los Angeles to the highest echelons of military medicine. Her legacy extends beyond personal achievement. Hundreds of medics trained under her programs, thousands of operators saved by her protocols, and a fundamental shift in how the military integrates medical personnel into tactical operations. Elena's story proves that excellence, not acceptance, opens doors, and that strength comes from adaptability, not rigidity. From fighting for a place on one team to commanding medical operations across joint task forces, Elena's journey embodies the power of perseverance, competence, and never forgetting your roots. Love inspiring military stories like Elena's? Hit that subscribe button for more tales of courage, determination, and triumph against the odds. Your support helps us share these incredible journeys of service members who changed the game.